Well, thank you very much, David. Good morning, everyone. I've been given a rather difficult subject to speak about in half an hour, which are global insights on science and humanity. So what I've tried to do is boil it down to about 4 challenges, which gives us, therefore, about 7.5 minutes on each challenge. Broadly, though, what I think we're going to be looking at and exploring are the kind of issues that you'll be seeing increasingly with your patients, because your patients are representative of the broad spectrum of humanity, of society at large. And what I want to explore with you is the question of whether, as this extraordinary century unfolds, whether on the left we're going to be heading towards the kind of people that are somehow devoid of humanity, robotic-type people who might be brilliant with computers but are terrible at communication, as shown here on the left. I often think that this is how people sometimes see scientists, hell-bent on world domination and grinning evilly, but lacking some vital part of human nature. Or, on the right, is this the first time ever that we can make the most of the extraordinary lifespans that are predicted, the more leisure time that we have to develop ourselves as individuals as never before? And of course, impacts very much on well-being, on peace of mind, and therefore eventually on general health. So let's have a look then at the first challenge, which is that, not an obvious one, of nanotechnology, which is, as you'll be aware, engineering on the scale of a billionth of a meter. Incidentally, for the ladies in the audience, don't you love the way male scientists are always portrayed? Yeah? They're always bald, middle-aged men in white coats, isn't it? Anyway, to one side, why is nanotechnology so important? Well, I often think it's like explaining plastics to someone in the Middle Ages, because it's going to change the nature of materials around us. We'll have frictionless ball bearings, and aircraft will be 50 times lighter, and on and on. That itself will change how people see the world, because if the material world is different, then eventually you'll be thinking differently from previous generations. But the biomedical applications also are really important. I'm sure many of you are aware of the innovations in drug delivery systems, for example, particularly with nanoparticles, which can be like a Trojan horse to smuggle drugs into the brain. But what's even more fascinating are the more long-term implications of having smart sensors, not just in your body, but also in the world around you. And these are just some ideas that you could be cleaning your teeth in the bathroom mirror, and the toothbrush will speak to you, and it will say, if you carry on like this, you're going to lose all your teeth in 10 years' time. Somewhat sobered, you then urinate, and as you can see, this is a laboratory on a loo seat, which will detect, for example, the glucose levels and could give you an early diagnosis of diabetes. So the bathroom will be a very hazardous place to go, where you'll find that everything talks to you and tells you, in terms of early screening, what might be happening. So, of course, this is something that we smile about now, but imagine living in a world where you can have early warning from within your body as well as the world outside. And for me as a neuroscientist, it is particularly intriguing when one thinks about implants and sensors in the brain. This is someone called Mikhail Nikolailis, who's a Brazilian, but who works at Duke University in the States. And he's done pioneering work now on brain implants in quadriplegic patients. And what he's shown is that you can actually capture the electronic signature generated prior to a movement that can occur, therefore, in paralyzed patients. This can be stored in a computer, and then it can be reactivated when, again, that person generates a thought, so that now a quadriplegic person can have prosthetic limbs and can actually, by virtue of their thoughts alone, direct prosthetic limbs to move. So this is an astonishing change, not just from clever toothbrushes and smart loo seats, but this notion that we can intercept what previously we thought could never be breached, which is the border between a thought and a movement. And of course, that has some very exciting, but also some very worrying implications. Looking ahead to the very long-term future, and therefore the ultimate challenge, is this concept of something called transhumanism, which argues that you can use artificial devices, be they physical and technical or chemical, to enhance ordinary abilities, both physical and mental. This idea has been around for a long time, of course, that one can improve on nature, but now it's actually a reality that some people think it would be important to enhance, even in healthy people, their sight, their strength, their memory, and so on. So we're all kind of cyborgs. Foreign Policy magazine has described this as one of the world's most dangerous ideas. And we don't have time, obviously, to debate this notion of what will happen in a global world where one has techno-haves versus techno-have-nots, why we would want to have such superiority anyway. But nonetheless, I just wanted to seed the idea in your mind that nanotechnology is presenting us with an extraordinary and diverse range of challenges. More immediately, a challenge is something you're dealing with all the time, which is the fact that we're living longer and healthier lives. But let's think about that, because very rarely do people consider, what are we going to do with our lives? Are we all going to end up just playing Sudoku? Or can we think of ways in which for the second 50 years of our lives, we can actually be productive? Now let's have a think about this, the implications of this long and healthy lives. I want to suggest to you that what it might mean in the very long term is that the traditional barriers between one generation and another could merge. Let's think about health. We know we're going from 400 to 4,000 drug targets. We know that genetic-based medicines are offering now early screening and the possibilities that has never before been realized. Stem cell therapies, regenerative medicine are all opening up horizons that would have been astonishing even 10 or 20 years ago. So that one statistic is that a little girl or boy born nowadays will have a 1 in 3 chance of living to be 100. Along with being healthy, we're all going to assume and presumably look better as well, because, as I don't need to tell you, the healthier you are, the more youthful and better you may look. But also, the technologies that previously may have been restricted to therapies can extend in a very blurred way into more cosmetic applications. For example, stem cell therapy can be used for male pattern baldness. And who's to say where mere vanity begins and good health ends? You may be familiar with a charity called Look Good, Feel Better, where thanks to the cosmetic companies, they give workshops in hospital to ladies who are on chemo and find that they are much better off once they've had these classes and sessions in how to make the most of their much changed appearance. So I don't think we should be too high-minded about drawing a distinction between appearance and health. Nonetheless, are we going to live in a society where we're increasingly intolerant of ears that stick out, or big noses, or moles, or whatever, and demand ever more the perfect and therefore more standardized face, something we should think about as again a challenge. Reproductive status, as we can enhance reproductive lifespan, eventually it wouldn't just be a question of freezing and thawing eggs, but perhaps eventually of extracting genetic material from any cell in the body that could be combined with anyone else's, so that anyone of any age or sexual orientation could have a child with anyone else of any age or sexual orientation. It would mean 6 parents to the child. That's the genetic donors, the donor of the egg, the donor of the womb, and conceivably the people that brought the child up. But nonetheless, it would suggest a scenario where anyone could have a child for the rest of their life. And finally, work, as we're going to a world where the emphasis is on the information economy and no longer a premium on how strong or mobile you are. And given the parlous state of our finances, with the pension age being pushed up and up, perhaps eventually the government will latch onto the idea that work is good for you, that it stimulates the brain, you can do it from home, and therefore you could eventually think of a situation where you're born, and once you've grown, you're healthy for pretty much the whole of your life, you look the same for pretty much the whole of your life, you have children for the whole of your life, you work for the whole of your life, and then you die. And therefore, there's no such thing as, a parent, a grandparent, a great-grandparent, but you're just an adult and that's it. These, again, I was asked to give you a brief to give you things to think about. So these might seem, they're not going to happen tomorrow, but I think the more we can anticipate them, the more we can harness the opportunities and minimize the threats. Now, something that sadly is a real problem for our society, I'm sure you're seeing many people increasingly presenting with dementia, it's what I personally work on. Just to remind you, by the middle of this century, unless something is done, there'll be about 2 million people in the UK suffering from dementia. And if you think about how many people love you in the world, let's say, or like you a bit even, let's just even like you a bit, let's say 10 people. If you have 2 million people suffering from dementia, that's 20 million people whose lives will be completely devastated in a way that even with heart disease or cancer would not be the case, because with those diseases, terrible though they are, you are still the person that you were. Whereas you may be aware with carers, especially, they're going through the stages of bereavement even though their relative is still alive, because they're experiencing the same sense of loss as though the person had been killed. So, what can we do about dementia? Well, obviously, again, we have very limited time. These are the approaches currently being used. Current approaches based on Aricept, for example, or galantamine, which inhibits cholinesterase and therefore boosts dwindling levels of the transmitter acetylcholine, as you know, are not cures. They're a bit like treating the symptoms, but they're not getting to the heart of the problem. There are some attempts at invasive surgery, which I think the jury is still out, and I cannot see the rationale of them anyway. Non-invasive approaches such as diet and brain exercises, again, are not getting to the heart of the problem. As you'll be aware, there has been no new drug to combat dementia, Alzheimer's, for the last 15 years. So the current approaches that are inspiring the current attempts at therapy have not worked, and I think we should really have a radical rethink, and that's what my own research is, and with the privilege of standing up here, I can share that with you. I call it the anticipatory approach, based on the idea you may be familiar with that neurodegeneration starts a long time before the symptoms actually come on. Now, if we therefore had a marker for these early stages, and if we knew how to intercept any more cell loss, then that would be a very positive way forward. So we need to know, in order to do that, why some cells in the brain die. Why do they die? Not all cells do. You can have a stroke, as you know, and you don't get neurodegeneration. So what is it about the cells that are vulnerable to neurodegeneration that distinguish them from all other cells? Well, the cells that are vulnerable are shown here as the white hub. You'll be familiar with the brain. That on the right is the back and the left is the front. And this white hub encompasses motor neurons, obviously motor neuron disease, the substantia nigra, Parkinson's disease, and the basal forebrain, which is Alzheimer's. And sometimes, as you'll be aware, you can have a co-pathology of 2 or even 3 of those. What's very interesting is these vulnerable cells are forming, as you can see, a very clear hub in the brain. And what's very interesting is that they come from a very special part of the embryo during development. They've been called global, as opposed to the normal sort of circuitry that characterizes the brain, because they send projections in a very diffuse, fountain-like way throughout the brain. So why am I talking about these cells? Well, if we knew more about them, and given they have a different embryological provenance, then surely they must be different. Surely we could target their properties to try and get a better therapy. So what's the clues? Well, I want to suggest to you that neurodegeneration could be a misplaced form of cell growth, because what's very interesting about these global cells is, unlike the other cells in the brain, they have retained the mechanisms that enable them to grow again. Surely that's a good thing? No, it's not. Look at the neonate. When the young brain is developing, you have growth factors released that will then help form the circuitry that characterizes the adult brain. Once you're an adult, if then you have an insult, damage to the brain, as we'll know, you'll have compensation from the remaining cells, as occurs in a stroke. But if these global cells are damaged, these cells, and I've just mentioned, that have retained their ability to grow again, it's a different picture. What will happen now is that when some of them are damaged, they will try and grow again themselves. And they will do so by mobilizing mechanisms that are wonderful in the embryo, but entirely out of context in the mature brain, such that now the chemicals they are releasing, instead of helping the cells grow, because it's the inappropriate context of a mature brain, which, for example, can't handle calcium as well, it will now prove toxic, and you'll embark on this remorseless cycle of events. So what we're working on is this very process, the chemicals that are released in an attempt to compensate, and how, therefore, they can be, first of all, sampled in the blood as a biomarker, and then intercepted in their remorseless cycle as a therapy. So the dream of what I call the anticipatory approach is to develop a marker in the blood that detects degeneration before symptoms appear. So someone could come to you and you could say to them after a routine blood test, well, I'm afraid there's good news and bad news. The bad news is you have an elevated marker in the blood. And according to my chart here, in about 2 years' time in your case, I'm afraid you will have the beginning of the symptoms of dementia. However, we now have a medication for stopping any more cells dying. So if you take the medication now, right now, even before you don't have the symptoms, no more cells will die, and therefore you'll have permanent prevention of the symptom onset. So this would mean the treatment would be a routine blood test for everyone, rather like people come for cholesterol measurements, but then a daily medication, an oral spray, a nasal spray, an oral medication that stops any more cells dying. So that's the dream. That's the dream that we have. The fourth challenge is the impact of the digital technologies on the brain. So we're now at the other end of the age spectrum. I wanted to spend most time on this because I think this really encapsulates many things that you may be seeing, from obesity to attentional disorders to depression through to schizophrenia. So let's have a think about how this new world really is changing the way the next generation is thinking and feeling. As you'll be aware, we're very different from goldfish. I don't know if I'm offending anyone here, but let's be brutal. Goldfish don't have great personalities, do they? Let's be brutal. So that if you had a goldfish, or your kids did, and the goldfish died, you could sneak off to the pet shop and buy another goldfish, and the child would come home and know no different. This, of course, isn't the case with humans. We're all highly individual. And why is this? Why is this? Well, we don't run particularly fast. We don't see particularly well. We're not particularly strong compared to other species, but what we do fantastically, which is why we occupy more ecological niches than any other species on the planet, what we do fantastically is we learn. We adapt to the environment. So even if you're a clone, an identical twin, you will have a unique brain. Unlike the 100,000 years we've stalked the planet, no one has a brain like yours or a mind like yours, because we are exquisitely sensitive to our individual environment. And as you can see, in the first 2 years of life, the growth of the human brain is caused by not the proliferation of neurons, but by the connections between them. So even identical twins will have unique patterns of connections because these are shaped by experience. And here's one example of the so-called plasticity of the human brain, involving 3 groups of adult human volunteers, none of whom could play the piano at the time. If ever you get the chance to volunteer for an experiment like this, I know that's not likely, but try and not be in the control group, because they just stared at a piano for 5 days. But there was a more fortunate second group, and they learned 5-finger piano exercises. And what we're going to see are brain scans over 5 days, showing even over 5 days the change in the scans when people learned the piano. However, there's an even more exciting third group, and I'm going to keep you in a small moment of suspense over this third group. So let's have a look at this experiment. Going from left to right, top panel first, you can see that for the controls staring at the piano, the brain is literally unimpressed. Literally. Whereas the second group, physical practice, as you can see, there's an astonishing change in brain territory related to digits even after 5 days. But my exciting mystery group are the third set, because these people merely were imagining they were playing the piano. So we could spend all day talking about this slide, I think. So I think this tells us a lot. First, you can't distinguish between mental and physical, between mind and brain. But most importantly, as far as the brain is concerned, the important issue here is not so much the contraction of the muscle, it is the thought that has preceded it. And some of you may be familiar with someone called Olaf Holnakowitz, who in the 1960s introduced L-DOPA therapy for Parkinson's disease. He came up with the most brilliant quote. He said, "Thinking is movement confined to the brain." Thinking is movement confined to the brain, just as you see here. I say, sadly, we don't have time to dwell on this slide, but it's on the hard disk here if people would like to think about it or look at it some more. So what's going on? Well, in my own lab, what we work on is the plasticity of the brain and the impact of the environment. And these are actually 2 snaps from my own lab, showing trying to understand what happens to the brain, how it adapts to the environment. In order to do that, of course, we can't use humans. We have to turn to our friends, the rats. And you can see here the impact of a so-called enriched environment. Now, enrichment for a rat, because they can't play the piano, they don't come to conferences in Glasgow and meet lots of exciting and interesting people. For them, an enriched environment is one that's highly exploratory. And you can see how happy this rat looks on the bottom right. Look, he's having a lovely time climbing over the branches. And then if you look at brain cells from experiments like this and compare a rat that was in a lab cage, here's one brain cell from an animal in an ordinary lab cage, with one from an enriched environment, I hope you can see the difference. The branches, the so-called dendrites, are much more extensive in the animals that have had an exciting interactive experience. So why is this interesting or important? Well, the brain, just like muscles in your body, the more it is used, the stronger and more effective and efficient it will become, as with the piano players. So stimulating interactive environment, even in a rat, makes it more active. If it's active over a sustained period of time, it will grow more branches. By growing more branches, you're increasing the surface area of the cell. By increasing the surface area of the cell, you're making it an easier target for other brain cells, so you can make more connections. So a stimulating environment in humans will make your cells more active. It will enable the dendrites to grow so that you can make more connections with other brain cells. What does this mean? I'd like to suggest to you it gives a meaning to your life. Let's have a think about that. When you're born, if someone showed you this object, you might be attracted to it as a small baby because it's gold, it's shiny, you might try and put it in your mouth, you can roll it. As you get older, you'll learn it's something you put on fingers, it's something called a ring. As you get older still, you'll learn that wedding rings are different from other rings because of the connections that will be formed selective to the wedding ring. You may then get a wedding ring of your own, and it will be more important than any other generic-looking ring simply because of the associations, the connections it forges in your brain. It will have a cognitive value, not a sensory one. And then if you go, perhaps sadly, from the honeymoon through to the divorce, the associations will change to that ring. So something that had once been just a shiny object you could put in your mouth now might be the most important thing in your life, by virtue of the personalization of that with your connections. Connections also help you understand the world. If someone came in looking like this, a small child would be very frightened, as indeed would a dementing patient. Why? Because they don't have the connections. They don't have the checks and balances of the adult mind that helps you understand that this is someone dressed up. They would take it at face value. This would be potentially life-threatening, and therefore it would be frightening because this novel aspect was something they weren't used to. Finally, connections enable you to understand, to have associations. When I was small, I was 13 when my brother was born, so when he was a baby, when he was a bit older, I used to torture him a lot, and part of the torture was to force him to learn Shakespeare. I thought this was very funny. And so when he was at 3 and I was 16, he had to learn lines of Macbeth. And one of the lines he would say was, tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace, and out, brief candle, life is but a poor player. And had you said to him, Graham, that being his name, what does it mean, out, brief candle? He would have said something like, well, there's a candle on my birthday cake and I blow it out. What he wouldn't have said is, oh, this is a metaphor for death. How could he? He was only 3, he didn't have the connections. So it enables you, connections enable you to see symbols in the world. So here we are living our life. Everyone has their own past, present, and future. Everyone has a cause-effect chain of events that give you your identity, give you your life story, that can't be undone, they can't be reversed, you can't unpass an exam. And this whole cause-effect chain of events that then gives you this personalized significance, this cognitive take on the world, is embedded in your brain cells. And I'd like to suggest that is what your mind is. It's the personalization of your brain in this way, driven by the unique dynamic configurations of your neuronal connections. Right, so what does this mean, given that now if the brain is so impacted by the environment, the 21st century environment is unprecedented, what's going to happen to how we think? Well, this slide is not to show that you can get free lip gloss and eyeliner from the Daily Telegraph, it's more this. This was a year ago, where I was one of 200 signatories to a letter that actually was front page news where we were concerned with the erosion of childhood. This was due to many factors. Again, we don't have time to explore them. Perhaps you're seeing this yourself with your younger patients. But in particular, what I was interested in was the impact of living in a world for long periods of time that is two-dimensional, only accesses hearing and vision. No wonder there is a relationship between with autistic spectrum disorder who are particularly comfortable in the cyber world, because I would argue that when we're in the cyber world, we're not using the clues that sadly are impaired in autistic spectrum disorder, so we are all in the same state, as it were, the playing field is level, because we're putting a premium on what you see is what you get, not on reading the signs that occur in 3 dimensions normally. Just to show that this may be the case, this is a survey from the University of Michigan, and as you can see, over the last 30 years, this was particularly accelerated, the authors say, in the last 10, surveying 1,400 college students, there's a decline in empathy. So what does this say about one's identity? Well, look at the history of blogging. In 1999, I just have to tell someone about this thing my cat did today. 2004, oh my God, cat pictures. 2005, moving cat pictures, and then that pinnacle of civilization, Twitter. 1 p.m., my cat just sneezed. 1:02, cat sneezed again. 1:04, cat hasn't sneezed recently. Getting worried. Doesn't it remind you of a small child? You know, look at me, mummy, I'm putting on one sock. Look at me, I'm putting on another sock. Because if you don't look at me, how do I know I exist? So are these people who are in this constant world of connectivity, are they in some way in some kind of existential crisis? I'd like to suggest. Just to show how important that this is coming, you can find out how important you are in the cyber world now by registering with this site Clout, which encourages even more this rather artificial way of constructing an identity outside of yourself, not inside, and therefore very fragile because it's very much the victim of what other people are thinking and feeling about you. So, social networking, less robust identity, decline in empathy, and an impact on new types of relationships in society, and we have to work out what these will be. Very briefly, search engines. If you ask what honor is, if you Google on honor, these are the kind of pictures you get up. And yet, if you showed this to a Martian, would they really understand what honor was? I doubt it. So how are we going to get across abstract concepts and metaphors like out, brief candle if we're now dealing with just images on a screen? Could it be the case that there will be less metaphor, less notion of the abstract in this new world? And this idea of being very mentally agile, as you may be when you play video games, but not understanding what something means, not seeing one thing in terms of another. If you play a computer game, for example, to rescue the princess as shown here, do you actually care about this noble Princess Yukihime? I bet you don't care about her at all when you play the game. But when you read about a princess, you care about her. Because why? She has relationships just like you. She has a past. She has a life story just like you. She has a future just like you, and you want to see what's happening. She therefore has a significance just like you in the way that Princess Yukihime does not have. So I wonder who said this. I worry that the level of interrupt, the sort of overwhelming rapidity of information is in fact affecting cognition. It's affecting deeper thinking. I still believe that sitting down and reading a book is the best way to really learn something. I worry that we're losing that. I wonder who said that. What Luddite would have said that? Well, the chairman of Google said that. So I think we are legitimate in having concerns. Finally, gaming. These little children are not, of course, playing with each other, they're playing with the game. And one looks at various trends. I don't know what your feelings are about prescriptions for methylphenidate, Ritalin, but there has been an escalation, huge escalation, in the last 10 or 20 years. Now, either this could be you're prescribing more liberally, or ADHD is recognized as a condition in a way it wasn't before, or could it just be that if you're taking a young child with the evolutionary mandate to adapt to the environment, and they're growing in an environment of fast-paced stimulation, because why else would it compete with the real world? Why should 2 dimensions outcompete 3? Because it's exciting and stimulating. Could it not be that this could be a component in the increase in attentional problems? And certainly that seems to be the case. There is increasing evidence of a bidirectionality between attentional conditions and video gaming, both with involving the release of dopamine in the brain. And that in itself is interesting because if you look at brain scans, you can see here again something that reached the popular press. Children who play video games a lot in brain scans have an enhanced area shown in the yellow nucleus accumbens, which is the area for releasing dopamine. This is also consistent with what one sees in compulsive gamblers. And when you think about dopamine, we know that it underlies all drugs of addiction. We know that it's correlated with high degrees of arousal and excitement, and it underlies the so-called reward pathways in the brain. So that would all fit with an excessive release of dopamine when one's playing video games. We know that dopamine is like a fountain in the brain. It does many things, and it inhibits the prefrontal cortex. I've been told to stop. Can I have a few more minutes? 1 more minute. Okay. So very briefly, that suggests there's 2 modes in the human brain, one where the dopamine is active, and one where it is inhibiting the prefrontal cortex, and one where it is less prominent and one can access the cognitive in the world. So I've just rattled through these, but as you can see, one can think very crudely about a world where you're living in the here and now, the sort of world when we're doing sports or drugs and sex and rock and roll, which takes us back to the more childlike sensory world where you have let yourself go, where you take the world very literally, as opposed to the more adult cognitive world where you're accessing those very precious brain cell connections. My concern is that if we are imposing on young people a world that is full of excitement and literal sensationalism, then it will never develop properly the cognitive take on the world. This is the prefrontal cortex, which I'm sure you're all aware of, and that can also be underactive in conditions such as obesity and also in recklessness, and we know that obese people are more reckless in gambling tasks, as are schizophrenics. So putting that all together, we know that schizophrenia is like childhood in that they're easily distracted, they have a short attention span, they cannot interpret proverbs, and both have underfunctioning prefrontal cortex. And I think what they have in common is the thrill of the moment. Anyone who eats knows the consequence of eating, but they will. Obese people eat anyway. Anyone who gambles knows the consequence of gambling. Reckless gambles, like the thrill of the moment, the roll of the dice. And that is shown in this painting, these series of paintings of schizophrenia, where you can see, going from left to bottom right, a transition back from cognitive back to sensory. I'd like to suggest to you, therefore, that an underfunctioning prefrontal cortex characterized and caused by excessive dopamine, which is the core feature of schizophrenia, obesity, and gambling, and childhood, has in common the fact of the press of the senses, and that could be what is going to be prevalent in the future. So, reduced attention, low-grade aggression, addictive and reckless. And finally, therefore, one could see a cycle of an exciting world of the screen causing release of dopamine, bring about reward-seeking addictive behavior that inhibits the prefrontal cortex, simulating conditions of obesity and schizophrenia in childhood where you put a premium on the senses and therefore you seek out scenarios such as the screen environment that pander to your senses more than to the cognitive, and the cycle repeats. This is a shameless plug for two of my books which say this in a way less garbled way. And I'd like to end, because we are talking about the global situation, with parallels between this very rushed overview that I've been giving you, which I call mind change, compared to climate change. With climate change, we know that there are many different problems. Mind change unpacks into social networking versus gaming versus search engines. Climate change is controversial. Some people think we're doomed, some people think it's exaggerated. Similarly with mind change. In both cases, it's global. In both cases, it's unprecedented. But there is a huge difference. Although both are in our hands, with climate change, it's really damage limitation we're trying to put the brakes on. But mind change does not have to be like that. We could be harnessing these technologies to start thinking about what we want to do. If we can make the technologies a means, not an end, currently they're an end in themselves, let's claw them back to making them a means to deliver for the next generation, or indeed for ourselves, a really good opportunity for shaping the environment where, as never before, we can develop as individuals. Thank you very much.